Hi, everybody. Welcome to Baphomet's Lounge. I'm your host, the incomparable NSS. Well, I don't know if you remember. How could you forget my last episode with Mr. Thomas Hood, the one who flew around helping promote helping MGM promote their movie with Zabriskie Point. Well, unbeknownst to you, Mr. Hood's grandfather, Gordon Hood, is probably one of the founding fathers of the modern aviation industry. And we have a multi-part episodes or a multi-part series. Today's being part one, featuring Thomas talking about his grandfather, Gordon Hood. And let me tell you, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. But before we get started, I want to share with you some pictures. These pictures were sent to me for my collection by Thomas from the last episode, showing pictures of the airplane that he was in during his promotional flight of Zabriskie Point. And I've got this picture here, and I'm going to blow it up right around here. You'll see it right here in the center. Okay? You see that handsome, tall, lanky dude? That's Mr. Hood. And let me tell you something about this. My buddy, Scott Davis, and I did a little calculations. He's in Mardi Gras in 1968-69. He's in New Orleans. He's flying around. He's in Los Angeles. He meets up with the hottest girl from his high school, and she takes him to the Playboy Club. He goes down to Mardi Gras in New Orleans. He's partying in one of the coolest times ever. And they gave him $200 cash to go have fun, which in today's standards is equivalent to $1,600. That's what they gave him to say, go out, son, have a blast. And dude, I envy you. You had a blast. And I live vicariously through because the 60s was an amazing era in my mind, and I just loved it to know that you were there, drinking it away and enjoying every bit of it. And last episode was amazing. Y'all just hang tight, because this episode is going to blow your mind. And without further ado, using the magic of modern technology, I'm just going to slide myself off the screen and slide Mr. Hood in the screen, and we'll be back afterwards to sort of close out on that. So, without further ado,
hi everybody, Incomparable NSS here once again with the effervescent and young, constantly smiling, as I said in my header, Mr. Thomas Hood. And today we're going to start a multi-part episodes central around Mr. Hood's grandfather, the late Gordon Hood. And we're going to start with some questions here. So Thomas gave me a list of questions, and he has answers to these questions. So let's start with the first question, which was, and it's a multiple choice question. So if you guys are at home, either type in your computers or write on a sheet of paper, a pen. Who was the first to fly? And the possibility of answers are A, Gustave Whitehead, B, Albert Santos Dumont.
Oh, good choice.
Okay, what in my pronunciation? Third, Wilbur Wright. That's C. D is Glenn Curtis. E is all of the above. F is none of the above, and we get a bonus answer, which is G, 2 of the above. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Mr. Hood. Why don't you tell us? Why don't you give us some answers to this question here?
I wrote this question, and I got to tell you, that's the worst multiple guess question I have ever seen in my life. Now, I got to tell you, I think they're all correct and they're all wrong.
Wow. So we can scratch only 2 of the above out of there. It's either E or F.
Not that simple. Well, let's start with Gustav Whitehead. they're 1901, and they say he flew, and a lot of people have been defending that. They've tried to prove it. It's even recently it was on 60 Minutes. I think that Australia picked it up and tried to prove it. Gustav did not do it. I am convinced he's the one true. He did not do it. Okay, and so here's the situation. There's nothing to back it up. Even the witnesses back down later. So what's our next choice?
We have Albert Santos Dumont.
He was given a lot of credit for the first flight because some of the public saw him fly for about 170 feet or so in this machine. He wasn't first.
He was not first.
No, but he got a lot of credit for being first.
Okay, so then go ahead.
The public saw it.
Okay.
They witnessed it. It could not be controlled. So if it
so it's a matter of semantics.
If
he fell off the top of a building, was he flying? I guess is
good. That's
your
a
argument.
good analogy. Because
is that your argument? Okay. So
yeah,
that leads.
If his wing tilted, that's the way the airplane was going, and he couldn't stop it.
Okay, so we're going to argue flying. So C then comes Wilbur Wright, of course, the brother of Orville Wright, which, as history says, where the first flight.
It's so close to being right, but it's not.
No.
So you're going, no, this is not true. Your guest here has no idea what he's talking about, right?
Well, he's got more idea than me, but he's dumping on how I was taught growing up. I mean, it's on the back of the North Carolina Quarter, first in flight.
The question is kind of a real specific kind of question, like who was the first? Who? And who was first was Orville.
Oh yeah, well, we had one more, which was Glenn Curtis.
Yeah, but Wilbur was the next. So what happened was Orville took a short hop, Wilbur took a longer hop, Orville took a longer hop, and Wilbur took the longest 59 seconds, 800 feet. So he was really first.
So Orville was the first.
So you really do get credit for that. See, that was the right and wrong. It was right, but wrong. He wasn't the first, but he was.
He was right by the right, but wrong by the right. Okay.
What's right in this question?
Well, let me ask you the third. The D was Glenn Curtis, and Glenn was not the first either.
Oh, actually, Glenn Curtis was the first.
Oh.
And you're going to say, well, how can that be?
How can that be if Orville was the first?
Well, that's right, because Orville was. And there's a couple of problems associated here. First of all, the Wright brothers figured it out. They had to control the wings of the airplane to keep the airplane level. They had to have pitch, and they had to figure out yaw, which is, everybody could figure out yaw. Even Sir George Cayley figured that out in 1807 when he suggested that it had to be a fixed wing with a rudder, but they're not in water. They got to keep the wings level. And the Wright brothers figured that out by warping the wings opposite each other and tilting the airplane. And so before they ever made the first flight, they patented this design, and they did it in secret, all this in secret, and then they flew 6 months later a powered flight. So they're actually testing their theory on this. So that was what really started it off. But then they went and hid in secret on the Huffman Prairie, which is the home of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base today, and they practiced there out of sight of the public. No one would see their plane fly, even though they did it. No one saw it. Every now and then they would invite somebody to see it, but there was only be one person, and they didn't know what they were looking at or couldn't describe it. They had no concept of what was going on. So by 1906, the patent is approved, and the Wright brothers, they didn't even fly for a year. But in the meantime, after they had put a bigger engine on it, they had actually flown for 30 minutes doing lazy eights and turns and up and down. They had perfected it by the time the others were even, like Santos Dumont did his in 1907, and all he could manage was 170 feet without ailerons or anything to keep the wings level. And several others tried to do things like that. But then here comes the Aerial Experiment Association. Now, who's associated with that we know? Could it be Alexander Graham Bell? What's he known for?
Alexander. Oh, get out. Well, of course. Is that you, Watson? The forebear of our come here, Watson. The forebear of why we're here right now.
So what's he got to do with the Aerial Experiment Association? But
did he call up his pilots?
His wife was deaf, and so he invented the phone so she could hear. Mostly deaf. Anyway, so he gets this group together. Glenn Curtis, who's been building engines that power hot air balloons or gas balloons and stuff at different county fairs. So he's familiar with power. He's the fastest man on earth at 135 miles an hour on a motorcycle with a V8 between his legs. So he's involved in it. A guy named Baldwin, who's from Canada, a guy named McCurdy, who becomes the first Canadian pilot. But they build 4 airplanes in Hammondsport, New York, and they have limited success at first, and then get better success. And by the time 1908 comes around, they build the June Bug. Scientific American has said, we need to see if somebody can really fly. And to do that, you have to take off under your own power on wheels, go in the air for at least a kilometer, and be able to control the airplane. And so Glenn Curtis invites about 2,500 people out there to watch him do this on July 4th, 1908, and becomes the first to fly in public. And so that's why the question is so difficult when no one has seen the Wright brothers. They have no idea what they can do. The French are calling them bluffeurs in the headline, saying they either have an airplane or they don't. And they've actually flown or they haven't. They're either liars or flyers. And that's the newspaper story. And the Wright brothers refused to put wheels on the airplane. They launched theirs with a catapult on a rail.
Yes, I remember reading about that 100 years ago. Yeah, you pulled the catapult pulled it, and they were on a rail, and then that was their takeoff mechanism. Yeah.
But once they got in the air, they could outperform anybody.
Okay, so in answer to the question, you're saying it was Glenn Curtis was the first theme, but the Wright brothers were the ones who perfected it.
And their patent is now approved in 1906, I believe it is. And please don't hold me to all my facts, because my head's jumbled up here, and I'm not the young man you suggested I might be that has the brain power to remember all this stuff. Anyway, so what happens is that that Glenn Curtis wins the $25,000 prize to be the first to fly, but from the Scientific American. It's in public, the media's there, public's there, and he's getting all the attention. 6 months or so later, McCurdy is the first Canadian to fly in Nova Scotia with the Aerial Experiment Association. So Curtis has got 2 firsts going here with the Canadian one. Now, they built the airplane in Hammondsport, New York. How did they get it to Nova Scotia?
I'm assuming fly it?
That would be our normal assumption. And that's what we would first think of. The problem is there are no airports. There's no refueling station. The places that no one flies. There's no airports. So you disassemble the airplane, you put it on a train, and you haul it to wherever you're going to fly it. And then you reassemble the airplane. And that's how they did it in those early days. You put it on a ship, you put it whatever, So anyway, they get up to Nova Scotia in 1909, and McCurdy flies it. However, the Canadian airplane, the Silver Dart, has already been flown in Hammondsport, New York first in 1908, before it ever got up to Canada. So who's the first to fly in Canada? I know. Could it be my grandfather? Nah, probably not. But
and this is how we tied it all in to your grandfather. Tell us about your grandfather.
Well, everybody got pretty fired up about flying after 1908, you can imagine. The Wright brothers did it in France in 1908, and Wilbur's in France, and Orville's got an airplane in Virginia, and the one that they sold to the Army. And so Wilbur, after Selfridge talks another guy out of flying with Wilbur in this airplane, Wilbur can seat 2. The other airplane, Curtis can seat 1. And so Selfridge goes up with Orville in Virginia while Wilbur's doing flights in France, and it's like he's, it's a big sensation now. It's caught on all over the world. They're hearing about this thing, and Orville's propeller comes apart, cuts a wire, and the airplane goes down with Selfridge in it. It kills Selfridge. He is the first fatality in aviation on September 17th, 1908.
And Wilbur survives.
Orville.
Orville survives.
Orville survives, but he's in the hospital for a month. He's badly injured.
Okay.
In the meantime, Wilbur's having great success in France. And in 1909, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. Of course, McCurdy in Canada, and others are starting to do this all over the world. Blériot, Farnham. There's any number of guys that are doing this stuff, and they hold a air show in France, in Reims, France, near the Champagne area, Champagne region. And so there's an air show there. And in 1910, there's an air show in Los Angeles, and things are really kicking off. Now, if
I'm
you're
going to take 30 seconds here. I was going to show these pictures here of these air shows that you sent me here.
Right.
This is the one in 1910, and I believe this is the one in 1908 in France. So
Right.
these are the ones touting the big stuff that's happening here.
That's it. Yeah, those are right out of that era for sure.
Outstanding. Carry on, my good man.
Well, as it turns out, then there's a lot of air shows now going to go on, and what they call the exhibition era. If you're trying to relate it to something, it's the early barnstorming era, but this is just people coming out to see something flying in the air. And one of the big meccas for this, mecca is a word my grandfather used for aviation, was Chicago, Cicero Field in Chicago. And so that's what's going on. But my grandfather, at the age of, I think he's 19 at this point. I don't think he's even driven a car much, if at all. And he built an airplane with his good friend Alistair Hunter. They grew up on the farm in Toronto, Canada. They looked at pictures. They looked at designs. They tried to buy designs. But as you can see, this was their concept of what the airplane should look like. It's riding on buggy wheels. It frankly looks very overweight. They bought this engine and propeller and radiator assembly here from Maxi Motor in Detroit for $60, and this was their concept of flying. Now, one of the main things is that if you're going to fly in public in an air show, don't take the picture down just yet here. Mm-hmm. You have to pay the Wright brothers royalties for that. They own the sky. It says if you have controls on your airplane and you're able to take this airplane up into the air, you have to pay royalties to the Wright brothers. And so there's lawsuits going on everywhere. Well, Curtiss comes up with this different concept. And right behind my grandfather, you can just see behind his back is an aileron. They're not warping the wings. They're doing the first ailerons that literally a separate plane that just tilts. But where instead of just taking the wing and warping the tip, which is what Wright brothers did. So he's claiming that he's got a different method for control. And you see this black sort of harness around my grandfather?
Right here.
Well, that's how you turn the ailerons in a Curtiss machine. And so they modeled after Curtiss, and you literally leaned into the turn. That's how you turn the airplane if it was made by Curtiss. And the Wright brothers, you literally had a stick that you moved and you warped the wing. So there's different methods that they're trying to come up with, and yet the Wright brothers sue Curtiss because Curtiss is flying too in this thing. So this is, a very interesting scenario. As this is going to be a moneymaker for the Wright brothers, because you hear of somebody flying in public for pay and getting sued by the Wright brothers. And
not unlike Thomas Edison, who by all the movies went to California because he had the patent on the film camera. So you got this little rogue nation going, and now these guys are arguing over, well, the way I'm steering it is slightly different from the invention that you made.
Yeah,
gotcha.
Yeah. And what I think it did for many, many years was stall innovation and the ability to think outside the box and make a better mousetrap. They were not allowed to do anything, with their with this. So this is another view of my grandfather. After he builds his airplane, he does go to Chicago in 1915. But before he does, this is 1913. What happens in 1914, a year later? Do you recall offhand?
Well, the big one would have to be the start of World War I, if memory serves.
And yes, it does interrupt their lives and their service. So my grandfather and Alistair Hunter flip a coin to see who's going to stay and who is going to go join the forces, who's going to stay with the airplane, and who's going to go join the forces, because the Canada is part of the British Empire. If the British go to war, so do the Canadians.
Mm.
And so Alistair Hunter flips the coin and loses, and my grandfather stays and takes care of the airplane, or tries. And he then Alistair Hunter unfortunately joins the forces, and within days is killed in this bloody war that killed millions of people.
Wiped out small towns in Britain. Wiped out the male population of small towns. Yes.
I mean, we're talking about millions, and I can't remember what, 17 million civilians or some ridiculous number like that, and
brutal war.
And well, there's another side note to that. But before we get there, let me just point out that my grandfather went to Sir Samuel Hughes, who was part of the Canadian forces at that time, and he says to Sir Samuel Hughes, "Let's start the Canadian Flying Corps." Well, there's not much aviation going on in the war just yet, but it's a mechanized war. There's tanks, there's submarines, chemical warfare. I mean, there's a lot being employed.
Machine guns, chemical warfare, tanks, submarines. It's probably one of the first modern wars. I think it's the last time the cavalry was ever used.
Yes, and disastrous for horses, as you can imagine, with machine guns, because they didn't have that in previous wars either. So I mean, it was just it was changing. And at first, there were sort of like rules to this thing, and the pilots would shoot each other with a pistol. Walt Disney has a great cartoon on that I did find online on the history of aviation. And then they adapted putting machine guns on some of the airplanes. Early on, they just shot propellers off, but until they figured out how to intermittently shoot between the propellers. But this was all just starting. And so the Sir Samuel Hughes turns to my grandfather and says, "The airplane will not serve in this war or any time in the future." Well, the future was just a year or two away when you got Baron von Richthofen, Immelman, Sopwith, who was an exhibition pilot in the United States, goes back and builds airplanes in England. Sopwith then designed the airplane that my grandfather, well, an engineer at Sopwith, that my grandfather would fly later. But it's, as far as my grandfather, they had to learn to fly without having any idea what they were doing. There were no instructors. You didn't go down to the local airport. There was no local airport, and there's certainly no local instructors. But you did go to Long Island to the right school, or to one or two or three of the places around the country where they would teach. But you had to go there to do it. Now,
yeah, and what did they know? I mean, they'd barely taken off and landed, for that matter, as well. Every movement you made was a new movement.
This is a very important point, because how much control do you give it when you're going, trying to get this airplane in the air? And my best example is, as a kid, you hung your arm out the window and you did this and that into the air. And when your hand was like this, it was real easy. But if you're driving fast, it kind of blew your hand back, right? Well, that's exactly how my grandfather did it on his first flight, which he was flipping the coin and he got that one, and he pulled the nose up, and the nose went way up, and then he had to push it down, and it went way down. He's going like this to the airplane when you just needed little movements like that. But they had no idea, so they had to figure this out. And after they scared themselves to death, they sit down on the ground, they talk about it, and they figure it out. They get up there and they start doing turns this way, and then they fly it back and turn it this way. And so they did figure it out. After a while, they could actually maneuver this airplane. And so they're self-taught, at 19 years old.
Yeah, but you do again. I'd like to stress the point that a flick of the wrist and you can crash. Okay, so like it's not one
Yeah.
of those like you and I are throwing a baseball back and forth and I accidentally hit you in the shoulder and you're like, oh, I won't throw it there again. I mean, it's just one of those. Well, I wouldn't. You may not be able to do that again. If you
Yeah,
don't.
there's no question. One wrong mistake, and the wrong one was first with the over controlling it, up and pulling it up and pushing it down, and once he figured that out, I mean, he had to go under some power lines or some kind of line with a telegraph or whatever at that point, and just did, and so yeah, they could have easily had killed themselves, and so I'm not sure it was a great honor to be first.
Yeah, well, I would say it's an honor, but I think what people need to really understand is how important that was. I mean, you were literally risking your life and maybe even the lives of others if you smash into a house or
Yeah.
cut off the power. It's really one of those things where like you say, he pulled too far back and he went straight up. He pulled too far, pushed too far front. And he went straight down.
Right.
How did he get out of that first to survive? Long enough to realize, oh, let's do it lighter, or obviously talking about it. And there is no precedent for that. Also, right? He pulled up and pulled. He had no clue. Like if you taught me how to fly in a plane my first time, I would be learning from you and years of experience, and you'd tell me this is what you want to do. That, and I would watch movies, or I would read books. I would read all this stuff, and I would understand the whole mechanics and all this other stuff. And okay, cool. And just like with me and computers now and all that other jazz, okay, we have to do that. There is no books here, and it's literally your life in your hands. And there's your grandfather at 19 years old, going, oops, I'm not going to do that again.
Yeah, and there is a story later on of the guy that he knew that built his own airplane, took it up for the first flight, and crashes it on landing and dies. So yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of stories like that. And but they figured it out. They talked it out between them. The next one goes up and doesn't make the same mistake as the first one. And then they said, well, I figured if you do this, and then they talk about it a little bit more. But that's really how you had to figure it out. But these guys were pretty quick. They're farm boys. They had lots of space out there, so they probably weren't going to run into anybody, and it would have only hurt themselves. But
they would have killed themselves.
Thank you. Or worse, yeah. It was.
I think that needs to be stressed.
Achievement, and then the war comes along, and then he's pretty much done flying. He wants to join this particular group, and the quotas were met for this particular Army group. So he heads to Chicago. My grandfather does in 1915, and I think you maybe had a picture of that up there.
Oh yeah, the picture we looked at. Yeah.
My grandfather goes to Chicago to be an exhibition pilot, and the really interesting exhibition is already passed because of the war. All of the well-known flyers that were from Europe have gone back to fight in airplanes in Europe. So by 1916, things are really winding down. 15 to 16 is about all that my grandfather did. But they did hop around the different county fairs and fly the airplanes in front of it. But it was just, flying straight and level, nice and easy. Before that, Lincoln Beachy and others would do stunts. And
how did they figure out these stunts?
They're bold and probably not really regarding how close it was going to come to kill them. Plus, many tried these stunts and because, I saw Lincoln Beachy do it, I'll do that. And they don't. Beachy knew how to get out of a spin, but he never told anyone how to do it. So anyone who got in a spin was going to die until 1917.
And what happened in 1917? Okay, we'll for a later story. Yes. Well, then you know what? I think you did send me a couple of pictures. We kind of went a little bit left and right. So let's take a look at some of these pictures here. This one, I believe, is Horton. This was your grandfather's friend that went to war?
No,
Okay.
Hunter.
Okay.
Horton was a guy they hired. And this article in one of the early aviation magazines talks about this guy Horton learning to fly, and that Beatty was his instructor. I think it says Beatty right on there.
George Beatty, yes.
Yeah, and I contact the Wright Brothers organization and confirm that George Beatty learned to fly in Long Island in the Wright Brothers school and has taught Horton. And Horton is now going to fly my grandfather's airplane. He gets going down the hayfield and hits a lawnmower hidden in the grass, crashes the airplane. Of course, the engine falls on top of him, as most of those push airplanes did, and he's scalded badly and is in a Toronto hospital for who knows how long.
Did he survive, or he?
Well, he did apparently, and then as they did back then, they just repaired the airplane and started flying it again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And then this picture here.
I also have Horton in the cockpit. That's that.
This is Horton again. Okay.
And on my far right, the far right on the picture on there is Alistair Hunter, who was the guy that.
Your grandfather's friend who passed away in World War II.
And he gets credit for this. I mean, I cannot say this is my grandfather's airplane and he did it by himself. No. And he did it with Alistair Hunter. Now, on the other side of the picture, you see that aileron, really a good picture of the aileron between, you just below in between the wings.
Okay.
And that's how here? Yeah. And then they had the steering wheel, and the steering wheel can turn the rudder, and then it pulled back and forth for the elevator. And I've tried to trace all the wires. I've looked at these pictures. I've blown them up. I've tried to trace their wiring, and I'm going, how did they ever figure that out? They did.
Well, I want to do something really quick. I just want to roll back for 1 second and on the mechanics, but this Hunter here real quick, and I think it's very important.
Yes.
I have studied history, and I've studied World War I exclusively, and just the fascination, just everything about life. And I want to thank you first off for giving him credit for helping your grandfather. And sadly, he didn't last long enough to see his work in action. So I just want to stress one more time, rest in peace, Mr. Hunter. But wherever we lost you by some small part, thankful that your friend's grandson is keeping your memory alive. Wow. And I hope that somewhere in this world, somebody who is a offspring from you, if there were any, say that's my grandpa.
Might have been too young for one, but
might have been too young, or regrettably then, that maybe that died with you. But right here, Mr. Hunter, we remember and we appreciate what you did. And I really want to thank you, Thomas, for letting the world know who this unfortunate soul was, for not getting the proper recognition. And if this is the point, I would definitely want to make sure that he does get that recognition.
And
thank you.
He joined the Princess Patricia's regiment in Canada with about a 90% loss of that regiment when it went to the field. It's just a sad story. My grandfather is quoted in an interview saying, and he goes, issued a rifle with 3 bullets and goes into the war. So there was some real angst about what they were dealing with when they got into that. I don't think anyone knew what they were getting into in World War I, as we point out, because it was so mechanized.
Yes, exactly. So now, thank you, Mr. Hunter. Officially here, I want to state it clearly, and let us go back to the airplane. So here's the wing, and you're saying the Wright brothers would adjust the wing, but the difference between the Curtiss thing is these 2 pieces right here, which adjusted the flight patterns, and then the steering wheel, which adjusted the rudder, and then
back top. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was,
and elevators right there, right under it.
Elevators. So left and right was the rudder, back and forth were the elevators, and the wings were straight.
Up and down. Pitches. Elevators are up and down.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Just like an elevator, and then the ailerons are the roll of the airplane.
Okay. So there you go. And this is the how this whole worked out. And this was, just to recap, was the controversial thing that the Wright brothers, they tried to get out of paying the Wright brothers, because they tried to argue that their design was significantly different from the design patented by the Wright brothers.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I guess what they decided was that regardless of how you made the airplane roll, it didn't matter whether it came from an aileron or wing warping. The Wright brothers owned the concept.
gotcha. And then finally, this was how we kind of started. This gentleman in the middle is Alexander Graham Bell. As we all know, the inventor of the telephone, which is slowly morphed into what the invention that you and I are using to discuss this now. But he, and to reiterate a point, we'll go left to right. Why don't you fill in the details of the people in this picture that he did? So starting from this left here, this gentleman here.
Yeah, that's the Glenn Hammond Curtis from Hammondsport, New York, who also was a bicycle and motorcycle guy, just like the Wright brothers. In fact, Glenn Curtis even tried to sell an engine to the Wright brothers at one point, and that's where the big conflict started. The Wright brothers claimed that he stole their secrets when he went to visit there. And so that was a battle that went on for many years. The next one is a Canadian military guy named Baldwin, college graduate, I believe, as well as on the other side of Graham Bell, McCurdy. Now, Baldwin flew the Silver Dart in Hammondsport, New York, before it was disassembled and taken to Canada. McCurdy is the first Canadian pilot in Canada to fly, but he's flying an airplane that was built in the U.S. and flown in the U.S. first. He's just first to take a Canadian airplane and
so
do that.
This gentleman here's the first Canadian to fly, but he flied in the U.S. This gentleman here's the first Canadian to fly in Canada.
That's exactly right.
Okay, excellent.
And so I maintain, and though I don't have any justification or backing on this, that my grandfather was the first Canadian because they designed, built, and flew that airplane in Canada. And I have not found anybody in between 1909 and 1913 that had done that. And I've looked into the history. Doesn't mean they aren't out there, just not recorded somehow.
Well, you know what? What you're doing is you're making an argument for your grandfather, and for hopefully whoever's watching or some historians may find a dig and may be able to either validate your claim or refute it. And in both cases, as long as we're able to scientifically prove it or historically prove it to the best of our ability, you're willing to accept whichever one. And I think there's nothing wrong with your claim. We'll see where, we'll see. And then that leaves us the last but not least, this gentleman here on the far right here.
And he was U.S. Army, I think Signal Corps, and he was invited by Alexander Graham Bell to join their group, more or less as an observer. And he was a flying fanatic. This guy just wanted to do this so bad. And so he changed his positions with a guy named McCall or something like that, and who was going to go flying with Wilbur. And on that fateful day, they swapped positions, and Selfridge, who was supposed to go up the next day, got in on that day, and that's when the propeller came apart. So Selfridge becomes the first.
This gentleman here, our first fatality. So this picture is amazing if you look at it.
Yeah,
look at the people in this picture, and I think we can't stress this enough. Starting from the left, Curtis, who was one of the flying pioneers, and is shrouded in I don't want to say mystery, but in arguments as to whether he or the Wrights are the first. But this gentleman here, then these two gentlemen here would have potentially the first Canadian to fly, but in the United States, the first Canadian to fly, but in Canada, unless we find other thing to prove that your grandfather was in. Right here, Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the modern day of the telephone, and obviously bringing together the world of flying. And then right here, the gentleman who is the very first fatality with Wilbur. Was it Wilbur or no?
Orville.
With Orville, right.
Forgot what the field name was in Virginia where they went.
In Virginia, the first. Unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas, this has been amazing. This is sort of like the precursor, and I can't wait until we dig in deeper into your grandfather and what he has done. And I thank you enough for this, and I just love, and to my fellow viewers, what you don't know is that Thomas sends me text message and pictures and ideas and questions weeks in advance, and it excites me so much, and I can't wait to do this, and I can't wait for the next episode now, because you come so prepared with these stories and all this stuff, and to me it's a surprise what you say. You tell me, like, here's a bunch of questions I'm going to go with, and that's all he told me. He didn't tell, oh, I had that list of questions and whatever, and then you provided the answers in this really wonderful present. So Thomas, we're going to get another one on the books, and I'm going to work right now. I've got about 4 hours ahead of me as I film my header and tail, and then I get put on the computer and I edit it, and then I master it, and then I'll get it up online and what have you. But it's worth every second to let.
Thank you. Well, let's leave you with this one teaser then. The date is 1917, and it's May, and it's Chicago at Ashburn Field. And this is an important start of the story for the next part here.
May 1917, Chicago, Ashburn Field. We're going to leave you with that one because that's happening next week. Thomas, thank you for joining us. I'm going to get to work. You have a great time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon enough. Peace, my friend.
Well, I figured you guys would get a kick out of this. And like I say, there will be more episodes. This is part one. To me, it's just, I'm glad that I'm helping preserve the historical record somewhere. And I'm going to implore you who are watching, if you know any information about any of the people mentioned in this, and for me, the young man, Mr. Hunter, who passed away in that dreadful event called World War I, and we've had many world wars or many wars and conflicts that have killed people way before they should have been taken from us. And I'm glad that I'm able to preserve his name and say, hey, he helped build that airplane and then got shipped off, luck of the draw, a coin flip, sent him across the seas to a land far away where his remains stayed. And if there's anybody out there that might know that might know a family, we probably think he may have been too young to have any progeny or any kith and kin, but maybe he was your great uncle, or maybe you've heard stories about him, or what have you from the Canadian area. It's a farm family. Maybe there's a lot of other people there. Man, get in touch with me, send a message. I'll put you in touch with Thomas. If we could find anything, just so you know that your great uncle or whatever relative he is to you did this. I think it's important. And it's sad that he wasn't remembered. And I'm glad we're able to remember him. And the other points that we put in the video, where Thomas is just saying, I believe that my grandfather should get recognition for this, but I can't prove it, or I'm willing to accept proof that he didn't. If you know something, man, let's find that information and let's get it stored in the record. That's all this is for, is to gather information and make sure people don't get lost in the shuffle that we call life. And thankfully, we have this great thing called the internet, which allows us that ability to categorize it. And I know people have said that the internet has its bad things and QAnon and all this other fiddle-faddle misinformation, and that's true. But hopefully, all this too shall pass, and that stuff will slowly sift its way out, and this stuff will sift its way in, and hard drive space and internet bandwidth and everything will be used to preserve this wonderful historical record that I think is so important to be preserved. So folks, if you like what you hear, please make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, share this video, help the YouTube algorithm say, this guy is cool. And I just want to be cool to help spread this beautiful thing called history, and that's all I care about. If you like Baphomet's Lounge, pint glasses, I have coasters, I've got koozies, all in the link below, handled by my good friends at Chautauqua Audio Works. They'll get it shipped out to you. you can enjoy it that way. And like I say, Baphomet'sLounge.com is the website. Lots of music on there and other things. And I greatly appreciate you tuning in and enjoying. So this was a long one, but we hope you enjoy it. We'll talk to you soon. Peace, everybody.